Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a thrilling story. Reina's life had always been ordinary, filled with struggles and quiet hardships, but that morning, everything changed. She had no idea that stepping outside her small apartment with her newborn in her arms would lead her straight into the dangerous world she had only heard about in whispers, the Italian Mafia. Life had been hard, a series of challenges that tested her strength, yet she had never given up. Holding her baby close, feeling the soft warmth against her chest, she took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, summoning every ounce of courage she had. The rumors about the Mafia were everywhere, stories of power, fear, and ruthless men, but she never imagined fate would guide her directly to the door of one of the most feared Mafia bosses in the city. Her heart pounded as she approached the massive mansion, surrounded by high walls, security cameras, and guards who looked more like statues than humans. Each step felt heavy, as if the weight of her decision pressed down on her. This wasn't just a step toward safety, it was a step into a world she didn't fully understand, a world that could destroy her with a single wrong move. Yet desperation and hope pushed her forward. She lifted her hand and knocked on the enormous wooden door, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The cries of her baby were the only sound, small and pleading, echoing in the cold morning air. Then, slowly, the door opened, and there he stood. Tall, imposing, and exuding an aura of authority that made most people shrink back in fear, the Italian Mafia boss looked down at her with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. But today, there was something different in his gaze, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even a hint of concern. Reina's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain composed. I have nowhere else to go, she said, her voice trembling. Please, I just need a place, for me and my baby. There was vulnerability in her words, a raw honesty that left no room for doubt. The boss stared at her, silent and calculating, weighing her presence, her plea, her very essence. Every instinct screamed at Reina that this moment was crucial, that a single misstep could change everything. Yet instead of anger or dismissal, he simply stepped aside and said, "Come in." Relief and fear collided within her as she stepped into the mansion, the walls towering around her, the luxury overwhelming. Marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, antique furniture filled the rooms, and priceless art adorned the walls, a clear display of power and wealth. But beneath the elegance, there was an emptiness, a coldness that reminded her she was far from the warmth of her own small world. She held her baby closer, feeling the tiny heartbeat against her chest, a small but vital reminder of why she had taken this risk. The boss led her to a small sitting room, the silence thick and heavy between them. He watched her, assessing every movement, every gesture, yet said nothing. Reina felt the intensity of his gaze like a physical weight, a force that could crush her if she faltered. Despite the fear, there was something in his eyes, something softer, almost human, that sparked a small flicker of hope in her chest. Slowly, she began to speak, telling him her story, the struggles, the loneliness, the fears for her child's future. And surprisingly, he listened. No interruptions, no judgment, just silence that held understanding, a rare act that made her feel seen and acknowledged. That simple act of listening, of truly hearing her, created a fragile connection, a thread of trust she hadn't experienced in years. As she spoke, Reina realized that her life had shifted irreversibly. What began as a desperate attempt to find refuge had turned into something more complex. The boss, a man whose reputation inspired fear across the city, was quietly assessing not just her words, but her spirit, her resilience, the way she held herself and her child. Outside, the world continued unaware, but inside that mansion, a story was beginning to unfold, a story of danger, survival, and the delicate beginnings of a bond that neither of them had expected. Night fell over the mansion, the soft glow of lights casting shadows across expensive walls. Reina held her baby tighter, feeling both fear and hope intertwine in her chest. She understood the risks. She was stepping into a world where power, control, and danger ruled, a world where one wrong decision could destroy everything she held dear. Yet, she also sensed something unexpected, a potential for protection, for guidance, for an unusual form of trust. The Mafia boss, who could destroy or shield her with equal ease, had chosen, for reasons she could not yet understand, to allow her into his world. In that quiet, tense room, surrounded by opulence and threat, Reina felt a tiny spark of something new, perhaps respect, perhaps the faintest hint of a connection that could grow into something neither of them had anticipated. Her life, once predictable and fragile, was now intertwined with danger, influence, and a complex relationship that would challenge everything she knew about trust, love, and survival. Holding her baby close, Reina whispered a silent promise. She would do whatever it took to protect her child, to navigate this new world, and to face whatever came next with courage. And as she looked up at the man who could change her life forever, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The story of fear, power, and unexpected connection had only just begun, and the first chapter of this new life had been written that very morning, behind the massive doors of the Mafia boss's mansion. The next morning, Reina woke to the quiet hum of the mansion, a place that already felt both foreign and strangely protective. Her baby stirred softly in her arms, and she instinctively held him closer, feeling the warmth and heartbeat that had become her anchor in this chaotic new world. The previous day's encounter with the Mafia boss replayed in her mind, every detail burned into her memory, the intensity of his gaze, the strange flicker of curiosity and concern she had seen in his eyes, and the almost imperceptible shift when he had allowed her inside. She wondered what he was thinking, what kind of calculations ran through his mind as he observed her and her child. Was he assessing her for danger, or was there something else behind those cold, calculating eyes? The questions swirled, mixing with fear and fascination, leaving her restless yet strangely determined to make sense of the situation. She had taken a leap into the unknown, and now there was no turning back. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished marble floors as she explored the mansion a little, trying to understand the space she now occupied. Each room told a story of wealth, power, and careful control, rooms filled with expensive artwork, rare books, and luxurious furniture. Despite the opulence, there was an unmistakable coldness that hung in the air, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. She had always dreamed of stability and security for her child, but she quickly realized that safety in this place came with an unspoken price. Every corner of the mansion, every glance from a passing servant or guard, reminded her that she was not in a normal world, she was in the domain of a man whose influence and reach could shape lives, and sometimes destroy them, with a single decision. Yet, in the midst of fear, a subtle thread of hope persisted. Later that morning, the Mafia boss entered the room where she had settled with her baby. He was impeccably dressed, his posture commanding yet measured, and there was a quiet intensity in the way he regarded her. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, before he finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You don't belong here," he said simply, though there was no accusation in his tone, only observation. Reina felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew he was right, she was an intruder in a world built on rules she didn't understand. But she also knew she had no choice. "I know," she replied softly, meeting his gaze steadily. "But I have nowhere else to go. I just need a chance to survive, for me and my baby." Her words were simple, honest, and there was a vulnerability in them that she could not hide. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded once and turned to leave the room, gesturing for her to stay where she was. Confused but relieved, Reina held her baby tightly, wondering what this silent gesture meant. Over the next few hours, she began to notice subtle changes in the way he treated her. He did not speak unnecessarily, nor did he act in ways that were overly threatening, but there was a pattern to his presence, a careful observation, a silent acknowledgement that she was part of the environment now, whether she liked it or not. He asked questions sparingly, yet each question was precise, probing, yet strangely human. "Where are you from?" he asked at one point, almost conversationally. Reina explained briefly, keeping her story simple, omitting the more painful details she had long buried. But the act of speaking about herself, of sharing even fragments of her past, seemed to ease something in the air. As days turned into weeks, Reina found herself learning the rules of this world, not through instruction, but through observation. She noticed the subtle hierarchy among the staff, the unspoken protocols that governed interactions, and the way the boss commanded attention without raising his voice. Everything was precise, controlled, and deliberate. She realized that surviving here meant understanding the delicate balance between fear and respect, obedience and strategy. Yet, despite the danger and uncertainty, there were moments of surprising normalcy. She saw glimpses of humanity in the Mafia boss, brief smiles when she laughed, small gestures of protection for her baby, and an unusual patience that contradicted the intimidating stories she had heard about him. Slowly, a tentative trust began to form, fragile and delicate, but undeniably present. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the mansion's vast rooms, the boss approached her quietly while she rocked her baby to sleep. He did not speak immediately, instead, he watched the gentle rise and fall of the child in her arms, the tiny expressions of peace on his face. Reina felt a strange mixture of relief and tension, unsure what his silence meant. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "You've done well to keep him safe," he said simply. There was no praise, no overt sentimentality, just an acknowledgement that carried weight far beyond the words themselves. Reina's heart swelled, a small surge of gratitude and relief mingling with her growing awareness that this man, dangerous as he was, had somehow become a part of her fragile sense of safety. That night, she lay in the guest room, listening to the quiet of the mansion, her baby asleep in her arms. The walls were heavy with history and power, but within that space, she felt a fragile sense of possibility. Her life had been forever altered by a single knock on a door, a moment of desperation that led her into a world of danger and influence she could not have imagined. Yet, even in the midst of fear and uncertainty, there was a faint glimmer of hope, hope that she could protect her child, navigate this complex world, and perhaps, in time, find a connection that went beyond mere survival. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the silent drama unfolding behind the mansion walls. Inside, a story of trust, danger, and the slow emergence of a bond between two unlikely individuals was beginning to take shape, delicate yet undeniable. Reina held her baby tighter, whispering a silent promise that she would face whatever came next with courage, resilience, and unwavering determination. And deep down, she sensed that her life, her heart, and her future were now intertwined with a man whose presence was as formidable as it was compelling, a man who could protect her, challenge her, and change everything she had ever known. Reina's days in the mansion began to settle into a fragile routine, one defined by careful observation and cautious interactions. Every corner of the opulent space spoke of control and authority, and she quickly learned that even the smallest misstep could draw unwanted attention. Yet amidst the tension, she discovered subtle patterns, small moments of mercy, gestures of protection that suggested the Mafia boss, despite his fearsome reputation, was capable of complexity beyond the world's perception of him. He allowed her space but remained an ever-present force, his watchful eyes following her movements, assessing, calculating, yet sometimes pausing as though lost in thought. Reina learned to move quietly, to anticipate his moods, and to navigate the delicate balance between visibility and discretion. She could sense the weight of every decision she made, but she also understood that this survival required not just caution but subtle strategy, a keen awareness of the unspoken rules governing the house. The baby became her anchor in this strange, tense world. She had never known that the softness of a child's presence could bring both relief and new vulnerabilities. The Mafia boss, initially distant and unreadable, began to interact with her in ways that were small but significant, leaving food near her room, occasionally offering advice in his measured, deliberate tone, and never failing to acknowledge her efforts to maintain order and care for her child. Each act, though simple, conveyed respect, and gradually, Reina realized she was witnessing glimpses of a man shaped by power and danger, yet not devoid of human connection. It was a complicated dynamic, fear and caution intermingled with curiosity and a subtle form of trust that neither fully understood. And yet, despite the precariousness, Reina found herself observing him as closely as he observed her, noticing the rare moments when his guard slipped, revealing the person beneath the legend, the man who bore the weight of responsibility, loneliness, and unspoken pain. One late afternoon, a disturbance in the city reached the mansion. An urgent call from one of the boss's associates hinted at trouble brewing in his operations. The air shifted immediately, tense and charged. Guards moved with precision, the staff whispered quietly, and the boss's demeanor sharpened, every inch of his presence exuding authority. Reina watched from a distance, the baby sleeping in her arms, her heart pounding as she tried to understand the magnitude of the unfolding events. She felt a new awareness of the stakes, a visceral understanding that this was not a place where mistakes were forgiven. Yet she also saw the way the boss remained controlled, commanding respect not through violence alone but through calculated restraint, intelligence, and an unspoken dominance that demanded attention. He was a man who could bend circumstances to his will, and she realized, with a mixture of fear and awe, that her safety, and her future, was tied to his decisions. That evening, after the immediate danger had passed, the boss summoned her to a private room, his expression inscrutable. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was a quiet seriousness in the way he regarded her. "You've adapted well," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Not many would survive here for more than a few days." The words struck her, not as praise, exactly, but as acknowledgement. She nodded, aware that her survival depended on more than just courage. It required intuition, observation, and an understanding of the subtle codes that governed this world. She felt a mix of relief and apprehension, knowing that each step forward in this delicate relationship came with both risk and potential reward. As the days passed, Reina began to notice shifts in the mansion's atmosphere, subtle changes that hinted at an evolving dynamic between herself and the boss. He still maintained his authority and distance, yet there were instances when his actions suggested a growing investment in her presence, checking discreetly on the baby, leaving supplies, and occasionally offering guidance that was more than mere instruction. It was as if he was testing boundaries, measuring not just her capabilities but her resilience, her intelligence, and her willingness to endure in a world designed to challenge her. Reina, in turn, began to understand that survival was not just about caution but about reading people, anticipating moves, and finding ways to navigate the fragile trust that had emerged. One quiet evening, the boss entered her private quarters unexpectedly. The room was dimly lit, casting shadows that softened the harsh lines of the mansion's opulence. He did not speak immediately, merely observing the small domestic scene, the baby in her arms, her careful movements, the quiet determination evident in her posture. There was no judgment, no criticism, only an intensity that made the air heavy and electric. Finally, he spoke, his words measured, deliberate, and carrying weight beyond their simplicity. "You've done more than I expected," he said. "You're stronger than you realize." Reina felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, pride, and the faintest flicker of connection. She realized that in this world of power and fear, acknowledgement was rare and precious, a currency more valuable than wealth or influence. The evening stretched on, filled with quiet conversation, subtle exchanges that spoke volumes. Reina shared fragments of her past, carefully curated to reveal enough to foster trust without exposing vulnerability that could be exploited. The boss, in turn, revealed glimpses of his own life, controlled, disciplined, yet marked by isolation and burdens he bore silently. In this exchange, a delicate bond began to form, built on mutual recognition and understanding rather than overt sentimentality. It was a relationship defined by complexity, fear and respect, distance and connection, authority and vulnerability intertwining in ways neither had anticipated. As night deepened, Reina held her baby, feeling the small weight against her chest, the warmth that grounded her amidst the uncertainty. She understood that life within these walls was no longer temporary, it was a reality that demanded awareness, strategy, and endurance. Yet she also sensed a subtle shift in the Mafia boss's demeanor, a recognition of her resilience and an unspoken acknowledgement that their lives were now intertwined in ways neither could ignore. She whispered a silent promise to herself and her child, to survive, to protect, and to navigate this world with courage and intelligence. Outside, the city continued in its chaotic rhythm, unaware of the tensions, alliances, and delicate bonds forming behind the mansion's fortified walls. Inside, a story of survival, trust, and subtle connection was unfolding, a story that would test their strength, challenge their perceptions, and push them toward a destiny neither had expected. Reina, watching the night settle over the mansion, felt both fear and determination, a recognition that the journey ahead would be fraught with danger, yet filled with possibilities that had never existed before. She knew that in this world, every action had weight, every word carried consequence, and every choice could alter the trajectory of their lives. And with her baby safe in her arms, she was ready to face whatever came next. Reina's life in the mansion continued to shift between the familiar and the unknown, each day testing her ability to adapt while keeping her child safe. She had grown accustomed to the unspoken rules, the precise movements, the careful glances, the way the Mafia boss's presence seemed to dominate every room even when he wasn't speaking. He remained a constant, silent figure in the background, but his subtle gestures of attention did not go unnoticed. He would leave a blanket neatly folded for her child, place a bottle on the table without comment, or offer a quiet observation that hinted at his watchfulness. Each act was deliberate, controlled, and layered with meaning. Reina learned quickly that these small actions carried far more significance than any overt declaration could. They were acknowledgments of her resilience, her ability to survive, and her presence in his life. The mansion, with all its grandeur and intimidation, had become a delicate ecosystem, and she was learning how to navigate it without drawing undue attention. One afternoon, the boss summoned her to the study, a room lined with books, documents, and maps detailing the vast scope of his operations. She entered cautiously, holding her baby, and observed him seated behind an imposing desk, his posture commanding, eyes sharp and calculating. "You've been here long enough to understand a little about how things work," he said, his tone neutral but heavy with implication. "But I need to know if you're capable of more than survival. Are you willing to act when necessary?" The question startled her. She had never imagined herself in a position where her decisions could matter beyond her immediate safety. Yet, looking into his eyes, she realized the gravity of his inquiry. This was not merely about her presence in the mansion, it was about her ability to navigate a world that demanded intelligence, intuition, and resilience. She nodded, steadying her voice. "I will do what I must. For my baby, for myself," she replied. He studied her for a long moment, then allowed a brief, almost imperceptible nod. The following days tested Reina in ways she had never anticipated. She was asked to perform small but critical tasks, delivering messages discreetly, observing behaviors of staff and visitors, and learning the subtle cues that indicated loyalty or deception. Each task required careful observation, a keen memory, and an understanding of human nature that stretched her abilities. Yet she rose to the challenge, guided by a mix of survival instinct and a growing awareness that her actions had consequences that extended beyond herself. She began to notice nuances in the Mafia boss's reactions, small signs of approval, subtle adjustments in demeanor, and an occasional rare smile when she executed a task with precision. It was these moments that made her realize he recognized her not merely as a temporary guest, but as someone capable, reliable, and worth noticing. The relationship between them continued to evolve, complex and layered. Fear remained, but it was interwoven with a fragile sense of trust. Reina had begun to sense moments where he was less guarded, allowing fleeting glimpses of vulnerability that contradicted the ruthless reputation that preceded him. She discovered that even men like him, shaped by power, violence, and isolation, could possess a hidden depth, a capacity for observation, loyalty, and perhaps even understanding. These rare moments, fleeting as they were, left an impression that lingered, making her more attuned to the subtleties of his behavior, the small shifts in tone, posture, or expression that revealed more than words ever could. One evening, as the city outside buzzed with unseen energy, Reina found herself alone in the quiet of the mansion, her baby asleep in her arms. The stillness of the room was broken by the soft click of the door opening, and she glanced up to see the boss standing there, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence thick and charged with unspoken tension. Finally, he stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her in a way that made her heart race. "You're stronger than I thought," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that surprised her. There was no overt sentimentality, no unnecessary emotion, yet the words felt deeply personal. Reina's throat tightened as she realized the significance of his acknowledgement. In a world where strength was often measured by intimidation and dominance, his recognition was rare, valuable, and validating in ways she hadn't expected. As the night deepened, they shared a conversation that was cautious yet revealing. Reina spoke of her past, carefully curating the details to protect herself while fostering trust. The boss, in turn, allowed glimpses of his own burdens, the isolation, the weight of decisions, and the complexities of managing power in a world that demanded both respect and fear. Their dialogue was a careful dance, each word measured, each gesture calculated, yet underneath it all, a fragile bond began to take root. It was built not on conventional affection, but on understanding, recognition, and the unspoken acknowledgement of each other's capabilities and vulnerabilities. Days later, a new threat emerged. A rival faction had begun probing the boss's territory, testing boundaries, and seeking opportunities to exploit weaknesses. The tension in the mansion became palpable, each staff member moving with heightened awareness, each sound amplified in the otherwise quiet halls. Reina's instincts sharpened. She understood that her presence in this world required not just caution, but active engagement, careful observation, and strategic thinking. She noticed patterns, assessed behaviors, and reported anomalies discreetly, all the while maintaining the delicate balance of trust and discretion that had become crucial to her survival. The boss observed her closely, noting her ability to act decisively under pressure, her calmness in the face of potential danger, and her intuitive understanding of the stakes involved. One night, after a particularly tense day, the boss entered her room, the baby asleep beside her. There was a rare softness in his expression, though it was fleeting, almost imperceptible. "You've proven yourself," he said simply, his voice carrying authority and acknowledgement. Reina felt a mix of relief and pride, understanding that her survival and adaptability had earned her a place in this complex world. Yet, beneath the recognition, she sensed the unspoken reality. They were bound by circumstance, by necessity, and by a fragile thread of mutual understanding that could easily unravel. She held her baby close, feeling the weight of responsibility and the faint stirrings of a connection that was growing, subtle and intricate, between her and the man who wielded power like a shadow over the city. As the moon cast its silver light across the mansion, Reina contemplated the transformation of her life. The journey that began with desperation and fear had evolved into a careful navigation of danger, trust, and an emerging bond with a man who was both protector and enigma. She understood that the coming days would test her resilience, challenge her understanding of loyalty and power, and force her to confront emotions she had long kept buried. Yet in the stillness, she found determination and purpose, a recognition that survival in this world required more than instinct. It required courage, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to protect the life she held most dear. With her baby in her arms, Reina prepared herself for the challenges ahead, aware that every decision, every movement, and every choice could shape the path of their intertwined lives in ways neither of them had yet imagined. Reina's days in the mansion grew increasingly complex as she settled into her precarious routine, balancing the need to protect her baby with the growing awareness of the world she had entered. Each morning began with careful observation, watching the staff move with precision and noticing the subtle ways the Mafia boss exerted control without overt displays of power. She had learned to anticipate shifts in his mood, to recognize the small, silent signals that indicated approval or disapproval, and to understand the unspoken rules that governed life in the mansion. These lessons came not from instruction but from careful attention, trial, and intuition. Every interaction, every movement, carried significance. One wrong action could provoke consequences, and she knew that survival demanded constant vigilance. Yet, even amidst the tension and fear, there were moments that hinted at something more, a fragile acknowledgement of her presence, subtle gestures of care, and fleeting glimpses of humanity in a man whose reputation was built on dominance and fear. The boss, whose presence had once felt like a shadow over every room, seemed to be changing in imperceptible ways. He maintained his authority, his calculated demeanor, yet Reina noticed moments when he allowed small slivers of personal involvement to surface. A soft word when she managed a task successfully, the careful adjustment of a blanket over her baby, a rare pause to listen when she spoke. These actions were subtle but meaningful, and they stirred feelings within her that she had tried to suppress. She recognized that survival in this world was not just about caution, but also about understanding the complexity of human behavior and reading the rare signs of trust, approval, or even affection when they appeared. One evening, a sudden commotion in the city reached the mansion. Rival factions were testing boundaries, sending threats and spies to gauge the strength of the Mafia boss's operations. The atmosphere inside the mansion became charged with tension, every sound seemed amplified, every shadow a potential threat. Reina felt the familiar surge of fear but also a growing sense of purpose. She was no longer merely a passive observer, she had begun to understand the stakes, the subtleties, and the responsibilities that came with living under his protection. Her instincts sharpened, and she found herself analyzing behaviors, noting inconsistencies, and quietly passing information along in ways that only the boss would understand. Her actions, though small, demonstrated intelligence, intuition, and resilience, earning him a rare measure of respect. The following days tested her in unexpected ways. She was asked to handle delicate situations that required tact and discretion, such as managing interactions with visitors and navigating the delicate balance between obedience and subtle influence. Reina learned that survival in the mansion was not simply about following orders, it required strategy, judgment, and the ability to anticipate consequences. She executed her tasks with precision, careful to maintain the fragile trust she had earned. The boss observed quietly, noting her adaptability, her calm under pressure, and the way she navigated a world that was foreign yet now felt increasingly familiar. There was a subtle acknowledgement in his demeanor, a recognition that she was capable of more than anyone had initially expected. One night, as the mansion settled into an uneasy calm, the boss entered her quarters without warning. The baby was asleep in her arms, and the dim light of the room cast soft shadows across the walls. He did not speak immediately, merely observing her, the child, and the careful way she had maintained order in the space. The intensity of his gaze was tempered by something softer this time, an almost imperceptible flicker of something human beneath the layers of control and authority. "You've adapted well," he said finally, his voice low but measured. There was no overt praise, yet the words carried weight beyond their simplicity. Reina felt a mixture of relief, pride, and caution. Every compliment from him was a calculated acknowledgement, meaningful because it was rare and deliberate. It confirmed her growing place in this world, while reminding her of the constant vigilance required to remain safe. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing moment, the bond between them evolved subtly. Fear and respect remained central to their interactions, but there was also a growing awareness of mutual reliance. She had begun to see the complexity of his character, an individual shaped by power, necessity, and isolation, yet capable of recognition, acknowledgement, and perhaps even empathy. Reina found herself carefully observing him as much as he observed her, noting his rare moments of softness, the fleeting glimpses of concern, and the calculated restraint that prevented him from acting impulsively despite the dangerous world he controlled. She realized that understanding him was as critical to her survival as understanding the mansion itself. One afternoon, the boss requested her presence in the main study, a room that exuded authority with its shelves of books, strategic documents, and detailed maps of his operations. He did not speak immediately, his piercing gaze fixed on her as she approached cautiously, baby in arms. "You've done more than survive," he stated, his tone even but heavy with implication. "You've adapted. You understand more than I expected." Reina felt a mix of relief and unease. While she had been careful and observant, recognition from someone like him carried enormous weight, and she knew it came with expectations and responsibilities she could not ignore. Yet, at the same time, she sensed a subtle shift, a small acknowledgement that her presence mattered, that she had earned a fragile place within his world. That evening, she reflected on the delicate balance of her life. The mansion, once intimidating and alien, had become a space she could navigate with increasing confidence, yet she never lost sight of the danger that lingered in every corner. The Mafia boss remained a figure of power and authority, but there were moments when his guarded demeanor softened just enough to hint at the possibility of connection, understanding, and recognition beyond the transactional. Reina realized that her relationship with him was evolving in ways she had not anticipated, an intricate mix of respect, caution, reliance, and subtle emotional currents that neither fully understood. As night descended, she held her baby close, feeling the tiny warmth and heartbeat that had become her anchor amidst uncertainty. She understood that her life was no longer solely her own, intertwined as it was with a man whose influence and presence dominated every aspect of her existence. Yet she also recognized a fragile hope, a sense that despite the danger and unpredictability, there was potential for understanding, trust, and even connection in a world that had previously offered only fear and isolation. Reina whispered a silent promise to herself and her child, to navigate this complex world with courage, intelligence, and unwavering determination, to protect the one she loved most, and to endure whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding within the mansion walls, but inside, the story of survival, strategy, and slowly emerging connection continued to unfold, delicate yet undeniable. Life in the mansion had begun to take on a rhythm, one that was defined by careful observation, quiet strategy, and the constant awareness of the fragile balance that governed every interaction. Reina had grown accustomed to the subtle power plays that threaded through every room, every conversation, and every glance. She had learned to anticipate the Mafia boss's moods, to recognize the small signs that indicated whether she had earned his approval or drawn his quiet disapproval. These lessons were not formally taught but absorbed through keen attention, intuition, and survival instinct. Each movement she made, every choice she took, carried weight, and she understood that in this world, even minor missteps could ripple into consequences far beyond what she could imagine. Yet despite the tension, there were moments of quiet humanity that punctuated her days, gestures of protection, rare acknowledgments, and fleeting glimpses of the man beneath the formidable reputation. These moments offered her a fragile reassurance, a reminder that trust, though tentative, could exist even in the most dangerous environments. Reina's relationship with the Mafia boss continued to evolve, the boundaries between fear, respect, and something more subtle becoming increasingly complex. He remained a figure of authority and power, commanding attention without overt displays of dominance, yet she began to notice cracks in the carefully maintained armor. Small signs, a brief look of concern, a soft-spoken word, or a rare pause before responding, hinted at a depth beyond the public perception of him as ruthless and untouchable. For Reina, understanding these subtleties became essential. Survival in this world required not only obedience but also an ability to read the nuances of human behavior, to interpret signals that others might overlook. She became more attuned to his actions, sensing when he was evaluating her, testing her, or offering a rare measure of acknowledgement. Each subtle interaction reinforced her awareness that she was not simply a guest in his world but a participant in a complex web of observation, influence, and connection. One morning, an urgent situation demanded immediate attention. A rival faction had attempted a breach in his territory, testing his operations and probing for vulnerabilities. The mansion's atmosphere shifted instantly, tension rippling through every corridor and room. Guards moved with precision, staff exchanged coded words, and the boss's demeanor became sharper, every motion deliberate, every decision weighty with consequence. Reina felt the familiar surge of fear, yet alongside it was a growing sense of purpose. She was no longer merely a passive observer, she understood that her actions, her attention to detail, and her ability to remain composed could influence the unfolding events. She navigated the mansion with heightened awareness, noting unusual behaviors, subtle cues, and inconsistencies that might indicate threats. Her ability to act quietly, thoughtfully, and decisively did not go unnoticed, and the boss observed her with a mixture of scrutiny and acknowledgement. In the aftermath of the confrontation, he called her to a private room, his presence commanding yet controlled. The weight of his gaze was immediate, intense, yet there was a subtle softness that had emerged over time, imperceptible but significant. "You've handled yourself well," he said, his voice low, deliberate, and unadorned. Few would manage under this pressure with the same calm and clarity. Reina felt a mixture of relief, pride, and cautious recognition. Praise from him was not given lightly, it was earned, measured, and meaningful in ways that transcended mere words. It confirmed her place in his world, not as an intruder or an outsider, but as someone capable, resilient, and worthy of acknowledgement. She understood that with this recognition came new responsibilities, higher expectations, and a subtle shift in the dynamic between them. As the days passed, the mansion became both a sanctuary and a proving ground. Reina moved through the halls with increasing confidence, observing, learning, and anticipating, all while keeping her child safe and maintaining the delicate balance that defined her existence within the boss's domain. She noticed the quiet ways he continued to engage with her, small acknowledgments of her attention to detail, fleeting gestures of care, and the rare moments when his guards seemed to soften just enough to hint at trust or approval. Each interaction reinforced the complexity of their bond, a mix of respect, caution, and emerging connection that neither fully understood but both acknowledged implicitly. She realized that surviving here required not just instinct but intelligence, empathy, and an understanding of human behavior at a level she had never before considered. One evening, as the mansion settled into the quiet of night, the boss appeared in her quarters unexpectedly. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, and the dim light of the room cast soft shadows across the walls. He did not speak immediately, instead observing her, the child, and the careful order she maintained. The tension in the room was palpable, charged with unspoken significance. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but resonant with authority. "You've earned a measure of trust," he said simply, his words measured yet carrying a depth that belied their brevity. Raina's heart raced, understanding that trust in this world was a rare commodity, earned through demonstration of capability, resilience, and judgment. She nodded subtly, careful not to display excessive emotion, knowing that her reactions were as much observed as her actions. As weeks passed, Raina continued to adapt, her awareness of the mansion's rhythms, its unspoken hierarchies, and the nuances of the Mafia boss's behavior growing sharper by the day. She recognized the delicate nature of her position, the thin line between acknowledgement and overstepping, between survival and exposure, and she navigated it with growing confidence. Yet she also understood that the bond forming between her and the boss was complex, layered with power, trust, vulnerability, and a subtle undercurrent of emotional connection. Moments of tension were punctuated by fleeting gestures of recognition, unspoken acknowledgments, and small acts of care that carried far more weight than words. She began to feel a fragile sense of belonging, a recognition that while the world outside remained dangerous and unpredictable, the mansion provided both protection and an opportunity to assert herself within the confines of its rules. Late one night, as she held her sleeping child and gazed out at the city lights beyond the mansion walls, Raina reflected on the transformation her life had undergone. What began as desperation and fear had evolved into cautious agency, strategic observation, and an emerging connection with a man whose authority dominated every aspect of her existence. She understood that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, decisions, and challenges that demanded vigilance, intelligence, and resilience. Yet within that tension, there was also potential, fragile, complex, and uncertain, for trust, understanding, and a deeper connection to emerge. Her life, once defined by ordinary struggles and limitations, was now intertwined with a world of influence, power, and risk, and she knew that survival and growth would depend on her ability to navigate it with courage, intelligence, and unyielding determination. Holding her child close, she whispered a silent promise to herself: to endure, to protect, and to face whatever challenges awaited in the days to come, prepared for the twists and turns that would define the next chapters of her life behind the formidable walls of the Mafia boss's mansion. Raina had grown increasingly adept at navigating the complex ecosystem of the mansion, balancing vigilance with adaptability. Each day presented new challenges, small tests of observation, judgment, and the subtle dance of maintaining favor while protecting her child. She had learned to interpret the Mafia boss's silence, to read the minute shifts in his expression, and to anticipate the unspoken expectations that governed her life within the mansion walls. He remained a figure of authority and intimidation, yet over time she recognized fleeting glimpses of a human side, moments where his attention conveyed something more than control or scrutiny. These moments, rare and subtle, became the anchors of her growing confidence, reinforcing her understanding that survival in this world required both caution and perceptiveness. The mansion, with all its grandeur and silent power, had become a place where each interaction was a lesson in strategy and resilience, and Raina was learning fast. The bond between her and the Mafia boss continued to evolve, delicate and complicated. While fear and respect defined much of their interaction, there were subtle hints of emerging trust, recognition, and perhaps a mutual reliance neither had openly acknowledged. She noticed the ways he would leave small signs of protection, placing items she might need near her room, checking discreetly on her child, or offering quiet guidance that suggested an awareness of her capabilities. These actions were layered with meaning, they were gestures that communicated acknowledgement and perhaps a sense of concern, though wrapped in the detached, controlled demeanor he always maintained. Raina's awareness of these nuances sharpened her instincts, teaching her to act not only for survival but also in ways that fostered a fragile, mutual understanding. One afternoon, tension swept through the mansion like a sudden storm. A message arrived indicating that a rival faction had made a move against the boss's operations, a calculated test of his strength. The atmosphere immediately became charged, every staff member moving with heightened alertness, every corridor filled with whispered instructions. Raina's heart pounded as she carried her baby through the halls, acutely aware of the stakes. She realized her role had subtly shifted. She was no longer a passive observer but an active participant in the unfolding dynamics. Her ability to notice irregularities, assess behaviors, and report anomalies quietly became invaluable, demonstrating to the boss that her presence had real utility beyond her initial vulnerability. He watched, as always, with a silent intensity, noting her composure, her decision-making, and her resilience under pressure. After the immediate threat had been managed, the boss summoned her to his private study, a room filled with strategic maps, documents, and evidence of his vast influence. The intensity of his gaze was unmistakable, weighing her as if measuring both capability and potential. "You've proven yourself more capable than I anticipated," he said, his voice low, precise, and unflinching. Few could navigate this environment without faltering. Raina felt a mix of relief, pride, and caution. Recognition from him was not casual, it was measured, deliberate, and carried with it both opportunity and expectation. She nodded silently, aware that every word, every movement, now held implications far beyond what she had previously imagined. Trust in this world was not freely given, and acknowledgement was an honor as rare as it was fragile. In the days that followed, Raina continued to observe, learn, and act. She became increasingly adept at reading the mansion's rhythms, the subtle hierarchy among staff, the body language of visitors, and the nuanced signals that indicated trust or deception. Each observation strengthened her position, providing both safety and insight into the inner workings of the Mafia world she had entered. She discovered that the boss, while formidable and intimidating, possessed an unexpected layer of patience and awareness. His approval, though rarely verbalized, was conveyed through measured gestures and calculated attentiveness, leaving Raina to decipher their meaning. It was a delicate communication, one that demanded her full attention and careful interpretation, and it drew her into a rhythm of engagement and subtle interplay with the man who held her life and future within his influence. One evening, Raina found herself alone in a quiet corner of the mansion, her baby asleep in her arms. The weight of the day pressed upon her, but there was also a quiet determination growing within her, a resolve to survive, to protect her child, and to navigate this intricate web with intelligence and courage. The door opened softly, and the boss entered, his presence filling the room with both authority and a subtle undercurrent of attention. He did not speak immediately, merely observing her, the child, and the careful organization she maintained. The silence was deliberate, charged with meaning. Before he finally spoke, "You've adapted quickly." Few could manage under these conditions. Raina felt the weight of his words, recognizing the significance of acknowledgement from a man whose standards were unforgiving. There was pride, yes, but also a sober understanding of the continuing demands she would face. Over the next few weeks, a gradual familiarity began to emerge, punctuated by moments of tension and subtle connection. Raina noticed patterns in his behavior, instances of discreet concern for her safety, brief but meaningful gestures of respect, and rare moments where his controlled demeanor softened enough to reveal a hint of humanity. She realized that navigating this relationship required both strategy and emotional intelligence, understanding when to assert herself, when to remain cautious, and when to recognize the rare moments of trust he allowed her to glimpse. Her bond with the boss was complicated, a blend of respect, dependency, and an unspoken recognition of each other's abilities and resilience. One night, the city outside pulsed with its usual chaos, but within the mansion walls, a quiet intensity had settled. Raina held her sleeping baby close, contemplating the intricate balance of her life. She understood that her position was precarious, yet she also felt a growing sense of agency and control. The boss, despite his intimidating presence, had begun to allow her a degree of influence, observing her actions and subtly testing her judgment in ways that were both challenging and empowering. She knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, difficult choices, and unexpected challenges, but she also recognized that her ability to endure and adapt would shape not only her survival but the unfolding dynamics of her life in this world. As she looked toward the dimly lit corridors of the mansion, Raina reflected on how far she had come, from a woman driven by desperation to someone who could navigate a world defined by power, fear, and calculated risks. She understood that the bond with the Mafia boss was neither simple nor predictable, yet it was undeniably significant, defined by layers of observation, acknowledgement, and the subtle emergence of trust. Holding her child close, she whispered a silent vow to endure, to protect, and to face the uncertainty ahead with unwavering determination, knowing that each step forward would demand both courage and careful judgment. The mansion, once intimidating and alien, had become the stage for a story of resilience, strategy, and a connection neither of them had expected, yet both could not ignore. Reina's life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. The mansion, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become both her sanctuary and her battleground. She had learned the rules, the unspoken codes, and the delicate balance of survival under the watchful eyes of the Mafia boss. Each day tested her intellect, patience, and emotional resilience, yet she had emerged stronger, more observant, and acutely aware of the stakes. Her bond with her child was her anchor, the constant reminder of why she endured, adapted, and carefully navigated this perilous world. Every glance, every movement, and every decision she made rippled through the mansion, carrying significance far beyond her initial understanding. She had evolved from a woman defined by desperation into one who held a measure of agency, insight, and quiet influence in a world ruled by power and intimidation. The Mafia boss, whose reputation alone commanded fear, had begun to reveal subtle glimpses of complexity that few outsiders ever witnessed. While still formidable, his interactions with Reina had shifted from simple observation to nuanced engagement. He allowed small acknowledgments, moments of guidance, and quiet gestures of protection, leaving her child's needs carefully attended, providing instructions with patience, and subtly encouraging her understanding of the mansion's rhythms. These acts, seemingly minor, carried profound meaning. Reina understood that trust was rare, recognition even rarer, and every deliberate action he allowed signified a bond forming, fragile yet undeniable. She found herself observing him in return, deciphering his gestures, expressions, and rare smiles, gradually realizing that beneath the fearsome exterior lay a man bound by responsibility, isolation, and a capacity for connection that few could perceive. One evening, the city outside buzzed with its usual chaos, but within the mansion walls, tension simmered. The boss had received intelligence about a rival faction attempting a coordinated strike against his operations. The mansion became a hive of controlled activity, each member of the staff executing precise instructions, while Reina remained vigilant, attentive to the subtle cues that indicated potential threats. She understood her role had become essential. She was no longer merely a passive participant but a contributor whose observations and insights could influence outcomes. She moved quietly, carrying her baby, noting inconsistencies and reporting them discreetly, fully aware that a single misstep could have dire consequences. The boss watched her throughout, his gaze evaluating, acknowledging, and silently communicating that her competence had earned his rare approval. After the immediate threat had been neutralized, the boss summoned Reina to his private study, a room lined with strategic maps, operational plans, and evidence of his expansive influence. The intensity of his presence was palpable as she entered, yet it was tempered by a rare softness, almost imperceptible but significant. "You've proven yourself capable," he stated, his voice low and deliberate. Few could maintain composure under pressure while simultaneously protecting someone else. His words carried weight beyond simple recognition, they were an acknowledgement of her intelligence, adaptability, and unwavering courage. Reina felt pride and cautious relief, understanding that this rare approval signified a place within his complex world that few outsiders ever attained. The recognition was not just personal, it was survival, influence, and a fragile form of connection all at once. Over the following days, Reina and the boss continued to navigate the intricacies of their relationship. Fear and respect remained foundational, yet trust, acknowledgement, and subtle care had begun to weave themselves into their interactions. She observed the rare moments when his guarded demeanor softened, a gentle instruction, a thoughtful glance at her child, a slight nod acknowledging her competence. These gestures were fleeting but meaningful, communicating approval and perhaps something deeper. Reina had become attuned to these subtleties, recognizing that her survival depended not only on obedience but on understanding, responding to, and sometimes anticipating the complex dynamics at play. She began to feel an unfamiliar sense of belonging within the mansion's walls, tempered by constant vigilance and respect for the power surrounding her. Late one night, the mansion quiet and shadowed, the boss entered her quarters. The baby slept in her arms, and the faint light highlighted the careful order she maintained. He did not speak immediately, simply observing, his gaze both assessing and strangely contemplative. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken meaning, before he finally spoke. You've earned more than survival here. You've shown strength, intelligence, and adaptability that few could match. Reina felt a surge of emotion, pride, relief, and the faintest trace of something she dared not name. Praise from him was rare and deliberate, and she understood its significance. It was acknowledgement, trust, and perhaps the beginning of a bond that extended beyond fear or obligation. She nodded subtly, careful not to overstate her reaction, knowing that restraint itself was part of the delicate negotiation of their relationship. Days later, Reina noticed subtle changes in the mansion's atmosphere. Staff and guards acted with quiet deference, aware of her growing influence, while the boss's own demeanor suggested a cautious acknowledgement of her role within the household. She had become a participant in decisions, a careful observer whose insights mattered, and someone whose presence could not be ignored. This new dynamic was delicate. Power, trust, and influence existed side by side with danger, unpredictability, and the ever-present potential for disruption. Reina understood that she could never afford complacency, yet she also recognized that the bond forming between herself and the boss was unique, complex, and difficult to articulate, yet impossible to deny. As the weeks passed, her understanding of the Mafia world deepened, and so did her awareness of the boss's intricacies. He remained enigmatic, controlled, and formidable, yet she could sense the rare moments when he allowed himself to show consideration, subtle protection, or acknowledgement. These gestures were more profound than words, a currency of trust and connection that was scarce in his world. Reina realized that her life, her child's safety, and her growing sense of agency were all bound to the delicate threads of their evolving relationship. She had entered this world out of desperation, yet she was now navigating it with strategy, courage, and growing confidence, learning the art of survival alongside the lessons of trust, observation, and emotional intelligence. On a quiet night, with the baby asleep and the mansion enveloped in shadows, Reina reflected on her journey. What had begun as a desperate plea for refuge had transformed into a life of cautious empowerment, strategic engagement, and subtle connection. The Mafia boss, once a figure of fear, had become a presence she respected, observed, and gradually understood in ways few others could. Their bond, complicated and fragile, had evolved into something powerful, an intricate mix of trust, acknowledgement, and unspoken understanding that neither fully defined but both valued. Holding her child close, Reina whispered a silent vow, to endure, to protect, and to face the uncertainty ahead with intelligence, courage, and unwavering determination. The mansion, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become the stage for a story of survival, influence, and unexpected connection, and she understood that the chapters ahead would demand every ounce of her strength, perception, and resilience.